A few years ago, we did a video about the top 5 Tier 0 decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! And it's been long enough since then that there have been several more Tier 0 formats. Enough that we can finally make a full top 10 Tier 0 decks in the game list. To be clear, a Tier 0 deck is defined as being 65% or more of a top cut at a major event, not simply being the best deck in that format. We tried to be pretty strict with this definition when selecting decks for this video. So starting us off at number 10, we have Furhires, which was specifically considered Tier 0 in Duel Links. Now, this segment of this list is mostly here to represent all of the non-TCG Tier 0 formats, of which there have been many. OCG Sprites, OCG Exodia before Sangan got errated, and many other Tier 0 Duel Links decks. The Furhires were one of the first absolutely dominant and recorded Tier 0 decks in Duel Links, though what qualifies as Tier 0 in this game is a bit different. Since Duel Links doesn't have anywhere near as many competitive events as the TCG, Tier 0 formats are mostly defined via sheer numbers and win rate on ladder. The Furhires were incredibly strong after their release in Clash of Wings, a bit of an earlier Duel Links set at this point. The Furhires can be split into a couple of groups. The level 4 and lower Furhires that each have an ability to special summon another Furhire from hand, and the high level Furhires that do other stuff that you want to special summon for free. This setup allowed the deck to do a ton of damage very fast, which was extremely valuable in the earlier days of Duel Links, and is still pretty good thanks to the lower starting life points of only 4,000. The Furhires could deal a ton of damage in a single turn thanks to their amazing swarming ability, and they had lots of utility on top of summoning big monsters. Recon Scout Furhire not only lets you special summon a Furhire from hand, but when you do summon a Furhire, you can destroy a set card in the field. On the other side of things, Dampa Marksman Furhire can instead pop face-up cards in the field when you summon another Furhire monster. These cards will let you cheat out cards like Dinah, Hero Furhire, and Wiz, Sage Furhire, both of which have an effect when they're summoned as well as powerful on-field effects. Dinah has the most attack of any Furhire, and also has the effect to force your opponent to attack it first, protecting your other smaller Furhires. It also allows you to banish cards from your opponent's graveyard for each Furhire in your field when it's summoned, which is very useful for messing with your opponent's strategies. Wiz gives you 500 life points for each Furhire on field when it's summoned, which isn't as useful, but it allows you to discard a Furhire card to negate the activation of an opponent's spell or trap card or effect, which is great protection for your field. However, the most important card in this deck is probably Beat Bladesman Furhire, which is a great consistency booster. This level 3 Furhire not only lets you special summon a Furhire from hand once per turn, but also adds a Furhire card from your deck to your hand when you special summon a Furhire while it's on the field. This means that Beat plus any other low level Furhire gets you into any of your big Furhires, as you can special the smaller one, add the big Furhire with Beat, then use the other small Furhire to add the big one and summon it out with the other small Furhire. This will even net you a pop off of either Dampa or Recon, as you'll be meeting their condition. The combination of the potency of these cards with their variety of powerful effects and amazing swarming ability, alongside just how consistent Beat made the deck, made Furhire incredibly difficult to beat. You have to remember, the game wasn't where it is nowadays all the way back when Clash of Wings released. A single Wiz negate was hard to play around, and the deck's multiple disruptive effects gave the deck a good going second potential. The deck's ability to get huge OTKs was made even more potent by the beatdown skill, the most common skill the deck played, which, once per duel, let you increase the attack of all your monsters by 300 times the number of level 5 or higher monsters you controlled. After you drew a few Dinahs and Wizzes on field, you could just use beatdown to push for 1200 to 2700 extra damage, which is huge in Duel Links. Furhires may not look impressive to the modern eye, but being a powerful, flexible, and overall consistent deck at this point in Duel Links was far too much for most of the rest of the metagame to handle. While we don't exactly have tournament data for the deck, it was listed as Tier 0 by Duel Links Meta, one of the most reliable sources of data for the game. Of course, this is only Duel Links, and there are many other decks that were extremely dominant in their time, and none of them are quite what this list is about. So Furhire takes the bottom spot here, representing a myriad of broken decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! That weren't quite as dominant in the TCG. And at number 9, we have Kashtira. This deck is practically synonymous with frustration in the minds of Yu-Gi-Oh! Players. The archetype focuses around restricting your opponent's options in a variety of ways. Kashtira Unicorn is a level 7 monster that can special summon itself from your hand if you control no monsters. Once per turn, it allows you to add a Kashtira spell from your deck to your hand, and whenever it attacks or your opponent activates a monster effect, You can look at your opponent's extra deck and banish a card from it face down. All of these effects on a hard once per turn. This can stop you from accessing important plays if you're not careful. And that's not the end of the deck's ability to stop your plays. Kashtira Shangri-La is a rank 7 Xyz monster that requires 2 or more level 7 monsters to make. Once per turn, it can summon a Kashtira monster from your deck during the standby phase. Every time you banish an opponent's card, you choose one of your opponent's monsters or spell and trap card zones and lock it down, preventing it from being used. And if it would be destroyed, you could instead remove one of its materials. This is the most infamous card in the entire deck, creating 9 to 10 zone locks that essentially meant your opponent couldn't play the game at all. As we'll see, this deck excels in banishing cards, so Shangri-La was able to trigger many times a turn with ease. One of the best ways to banish cards is the deck's biggest, baddest boss monster, Kashtira Arise Heart. This is a rank 7 Xyz monster that requires 3 level 7 monsters to summon. However, you can also summon it over any single Kashtira monster you control if a player activated Shangri-La's effect this turn. Any card sent to the graveyard gets banished instead. Once per chain, when a card is banished, you can target a banished card and attach it to this card. And you can remove 3 Xyz materials from Arise Heart to target any card in the field and banish it face down. The Macrocosmos style effect not only stops many decks from working at all on its own, but it also means that Arise Heart will be getting a ton of materials to banish even more cards, as well as giving your Shangri-La more chances to activate and lock your opponent out of plane every time you use its ability to banish a singular card face down. On top of having ways of cutting off your opponent from the game, the deck also had a slew of other powerful cards. Kashtira Fenrir was strong enough and splashable enough that many decks outside of Kashtira used it as well. Once per turn, if you have no monsters, you can special summon it from your hand. When it declares an attack, or an opponent activates a monster effect, you can target one face-up card your opponent controls and banish it face down. And you can add a Kashtira monster from your deck to your hand during your main phase. Both of these effects on a hard once per turn. And it can add copies of itself, by the way, which made the card extremely annoying to play against regardless of what deck your opponent was playing Fenrir in. Kashtira Birth allows you to normal summon a level 7 monster without tributing, and once per turn, special summon a non-Xyz Kashtira monster from your banishment or graveyard. Also, if your opponent activates a spell card or effect, you get to banish 3 cards in their graveyard face down, just to mess with them even more. Other support like Pressure Planet Racewath and Kashtira Theosis both gave the deck more consistency and extension, as well as more grind game and power, meaning the deck was actually able to pull off its win conditions somewhat consistently. However, Kashtira did have some notable weaknesses. If you try to lock your opponent out of the game with Shangri-La, you were kind of putting a lot of eggs in one basket. As soon as your opponent outed Shangri-La with something like a Kaiju, they'd be able to play as normal once again, or at least have access to way more zones than they did before. This led to cards like Book of Moon becoming common sideboard cards to help against the deck, as it was very hard to lock all 10 of your opponent's main zones before your opponent got at least their standby phase and could use a quick play spell, and you definitely weren't locking 9 zones and getting an Omni Negate up consistently. While cards like Arise Heart are very powerful, they aren't impossible to beat either, just very difficult to navigate around. Not to mention that the deck was a bit clunkier than some of the other decks we'll be seeing later on this list. At least clunkier than most other top decks post Power of the Elements have been. This relative level of inconsistency and the fact that, even after they got full combo, your opponent often did have some meaningful counterplay meant that Kashtira wasn't completely unbeatable at any point. It was the best deck in the game considering just how powerful its individual cards were, and how difficult to beat a 9-zone lock is for most of the decks in the game. But it never took over the entire game like some of the other cards on this list. At events like YCS Los Angeles in 2023, it took 11 of the top 16 spots and 19 of the top 36 spots, which would translate to 69% representation in top 16 and 53 representation in top 36, which overall would lock it in at a tier 0 status. However, even if Kashtira isn't quite a tier 0 deck via the strictest definition of the tier, it's at least one of the most feared and hated tier 1 decks to ever dominate a format. Thanks to barely sneaking into tier 0 and being one of the most infamous decks ever released, Kashtira is barely able to slide into this list. And at number 8, we have Nekroz. This is a deck of ritual cards, a famously underpowered mechanic in Yu-Gi-Oh! Since most ritual strategies require you to have a ritual spell, a ritual monster, and a tribute in hand to summon a ritual monster, which is both very resource intensive and extremely clunky. To make this mechanic better, the Nekroz archetype were given many upsides. Their ritual spells, Nekroz Cycle, Nekroz Mirror, and Nekroz Kaleidoscope, all have their effects to banish themselves and a Nekroz monster from grave to add a Nekroz spell from your deck to your hand, but only if you control no monsters. The Necroz monsters themselves also all had abilities that could be activated when they were in your hand to make the deck more consistent. Necroz of Trishula can discard itself from hand to negate the effect of a card that targets one of your Necroz monsters. Necroz of Brionac can discard itself to add a Necroz monster from deck to hand, including Necroz of Clausulus, which can discard itself to search any Necroz spell card. Necroz of Unicorn discards itself to add back a Necroz monster to your graveyard. Necroz of Gungear discards itself to make a Necroz immune to destruction by battle and card effect for a turn, and Necroz of Catastrophe discards itself to special back a Necroz monster. On top of these incredibly useful and versatile hand effects, they also had great effects while on the field. Necroz of Trishula banishes a card from your opponent's hand, field, and graveyard on summon, a very powerful removal option. Brionac can shuffle 2 monsters special summon from the extra deck back into the deck. Necroz of Valkyrus allows you to tribute up to 2 monsters on your field or hand to draw the same number of cards. Necroz of Gungear was a repeatable removal, and Necroz of Unicorn negates the effects of all special summon monsters from the extra deck. As you can tell, this deck not only had a lot of consistency and removal, but several effects that could stop the average deck from completing their game plan. However, Konami still had a few tricks up their sleeve to help this archetype shine. Shurit, Strategist of the Necroz, not only allows itself to be the full requirement of a ritual summon for a Necroz monster, it also adds a Warrior Necroz ritual monster from deck to hand when you use it for this purpose, giving the deck more card advantage, more consistency, and lowering the cost of bringing out its powerful ritual monsters. The final nail in the coffin for this deck's power was Jin Release of Rituals. This level 3 Dark Fiend can be banished from the graveyard as a material for ritual summon, and when it's used as a material for ritual summon, your opponent can't special summon monsters for as long as you have that ritual summon monster face up on the field. The Jin lock was terrifying and weirdly consistent to pull off, forcing your opponent to play a ton of cards like our good friend Book of Moon to try and even be allowed to play the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! This put a lot of pressure on your opponent during deck building, which was great for the Necroz player, as it meant that your opponent would be packing a ton of cards that were overall worse than the Necroz engine. The thing is, even if you outed the Jin lock as it was called, it's not like you won the game. The Necroz deck was more than capable of making the lock without overcommitting, and had a ton of ways to stay in the game for many turns as well as deal with whatever board you put up. Remember, this was decades ago. Not every deck was able to easily OTK your opponent yet. It's not like with Kashtira, where if your opponent legitimately did just go for a 9 zone lock with no other threats, you could just unlock your zones and do a 1-card combo to win. Every deck's combo needed multiple cards to work, so needing to have enough outs to the Jin lock on top of drawing enough cards to do your own combo was very difficult, especially since Necroz was already a strong enough deck to compete with the rest of the field without the Jin lock even coming up. The combined assault of one of the most consistent and powerful archetypes the game had seen yet, released alongside one of the most powerful lingering floodgates a combo deck had ever seen, being able to incorporate it into its engine, created an almost insurmountable deck, one of the most powerful the game had ever seen. It's no wonder this led to a Tier 0 format, where nothing except Necroz was able to compete. Unlike with Kashtira, nothing else was even really able to sneak into the top 8 when Necroz was around. At YCS Paraguay in 2015, the deck took 24 of the top 32 spots. It took 20 of the top 32 spots in the YCS Chicago, and took 12 of the top 16 in YCS Bogota. You get the picture. Necroz was just about the only thing even in striking distance of winning a YCS at the time. Still, the gap in pure power between Necroz and the other decks in the game at the time wasn't anywhere near as high as in some other formats, with the next spot on this list being a great example of this disparity. And at number 7, we have Chaos Emperor Dragon Envoy of the End, the flagship card of Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG's first proper Tier 0 format, and the deck that caused the first real ban list. While cards had been restricted before, this deck pushed Konami to finally pull the trigger and take cards behind the shed for good. Chaos Emperor Dragon is a dark level 8 dragon with 3000 attack and 2500 defense. It can't be normal summoned or set, and can only be special summoned by banishing a light and dark monster from your graveyard. It also originally had the effect where you could pay 1000 life points to send as many cards in both players' hand and on the field to the graveyard as possible. Then inflict 300 damage to your opponent for each card sent to the graveyard by this effect. This alone is a really strong effect, especially all the way back in 2004 when the card was first released. The game was just a lot slower, so having a card that could either be a free 3000 beater, or a reset button in a pinch, would have already been good enough. However, there was a way to go further with this card. The cards Sangan and Witch of the Black Forest both had the effect to add a monster from your deck to your hand with 1500 or less attack or defense respectively when the cards were sent to the graveyard. And this would trigger if they were on the field when you activated Chaos Ember Dragon's effect. This can allow you to go and find Yatagarasu. This is a mere level 2 Wind Fiend with only 200 attack. It's also a spirit, so it has the same downside where it can't be special summoned and bounces to your hand at the end of the turn if it's normal summoned or flip face up. However, when it inflicts battle damage to your opponent, they skip their next draw phase. This can be a very powerful effect, as it stops your opponent from ever drawing an out if they're in a losing position. Combining all three of these cards gives you the infamous Yata lock. You simply need to get Sangan or Witch on the field, then activate Chaos Ember Dragon and use its effect. Then you use the Sangan or Witch to add a Yatagarasu to your hand and normal summon it. You use its effect to stop your opponent's next draw, who at this point on an empty hand lacks a board and won't get to draw, so they'll have no possible game actions they can make. This is effectively the end of the game. And this kind of combo was way too much for the game at the time. All of these cards outside of Yatagarasu are already staples in that metagame, worth playing on their own. Getting to sometimes win the game out of nowhere if your opponent lets a Sangan or Witch stick around for a turn, and having a Chaos Emperor Dragon in your hand was just pretty crazy. Now, this combo is pretty awful by today's standards, but we're not looking at which of these decks would be the best if they were legal today. That would just be ranking these decks by order of release. We're ranking them by how powerful they were in their original context, and Chaos Emperor Dragon was much further above the power level of the rest of the format than any of the other decks we've mentioned so far. However, the deck wasn't unbeatable. The combo is a bit inconsistent, and good draws can allow you to beat CED before it even has a chance to lock you out of the game. We don't have much data from this time, as the resources for collecting top results and the like at the time were incredibly sparse. But we do have what indicates that the deck was having a huge impact on the metagame. The fact that it led to bans for the first time ever is proof enough that at least Konami felt like it was too oppressive. All in all, for being the first Tier 0 deck in the game, and being the deck to literally create the ban list, is quite the legacy to leave. And at number 6, we have TeleDAD, named after Emergency Teleport and Dark Arm Dragon. E-Tele is a quick play spell that allows you to summon a level 3 or lower Psychic type monster from your hand or deck, but it's banished during the end phase. Dark Arm Dragon is a level 7 Dark Dragon with 2800 attack, which can't be normal summon or set, but can be special summoned from your hand if there are exactly 3 monsters in your graveyard. It also allows you to banish a dark monster from your graveyard to target one card on the field and destroy it. This deck came into being right at the start of the Synchro era, and it quickly established itself as the top dog in the new format. Dark Arm Dragon had already proven itself to be a menace in the format before it got its partner in crime in E-Teleport for a variety of reasons. For one, being able to special summon a huge monster from your hand and then blow up 3 cards on the field for no investment was kind of just insane at this point in the game. Even heavy hitters like Blackluster Soldier and Void of the Beginning, who was banned at the time, required banishing monsters from your graveyard to bring it out, and had to skip out on attacking to use its banish effect. Not to mention that the effect was a once per turn. In contrast, DAD didn't need to banish anything to bring itself out, and could use its effect as much as it wanted as long as you had the materials in your graveyard. This was made even better by how priority worked at this point in the game, as you got to act before your opponent after summoning a monster, letting you use DAD's Spell Speed 1 destruction effect before they could use a card like Bottomless Trap Hole to remove it. You could also easily swarm your opponent with DADs if you drew more than one at once, letting you put out up to 8400 damage out of nowhere. Of course, it didn't become a Tier 0 format just because of DAD. It had a lot of help thanks to the mountains of dark attribute support in the game at the time, as well as playing extremely well with the Destiny Draw package. It also played well with Return from the Different Dimension that was still legal for some reason, which allowed you to special summon back all of your banished monsters. Emergency Teleport made this entire strategy far more flexible by allowing you to special summon a Krebons from your deck without taking up your normal summon. This level 2 tuner could pay life points and negate attacks, but more importantly, it was a dark monster that you could synchro off with your normal summon for a powerful synchro monster, while also filling up your graveyard with more darks for Dark Arm Dragon to come in and sweep up. Emergency Teleport was kind of just the straw that broke the camel's back, the thing that pushed Dark Arm Dragon from being one of the best decks in the format to being the undisputed best deck in the format, by allowing the deck to access both powerful synchro boss monsters and letting them set up their graveyard for DAD even more easily. All of this allowed the deck to absolutely destroy big tournaments at the time. It took 11 of the top 16 spots at SJ Tulsa, was the entirety of the top 8 at SJ Seattle, took 7 of the top 8 at SJ Chicago, SJ San Francisco, took 5 of the top 8 at SJ Atlanta, and 15 of the top 16 at SJ Houston. The deck was seemingly unbeatable during its heyday, and Konami took frustrating little action to curb its success. For nearly a year, TeleDAD was drowning out every other strategy at a tide of value that they simply couldn't keep up with. And at number 5, we have Zodiac. This is an archetype with a very simple gimmick. All of its Xyz monsters had an effect where, once per turn, you could summon them using any Zodiac monster as their full material. This on its own sounds very powerful. After all, essentially all other Xyz require at least 2 materials, so getting a monster that should require at least 2 monsters to make for only 1 sounds like a great deal. Of course, this wouldn't matter if the Xyz monsters themselves weren't any good, but the Zodiac lineup had plenty of good Xyz. Among these, the most important are Zodiac Trident and Zodiac Broadbull. On top of the standard effects of all Zodiac Xyz to rank up over another Zodiac and gain the attack and defense of all Zodiacs attached to them as material, Trident had the ability to detach an Xyz material to target a face-up card in the field and destroy it as a quick effect. Broadbull had both of the standard effects and could detach an Xyz material to add a Beast Warrior type monster that can be normal summon or set from your deck to your hand, which describes the entire archetype. Essentially, Broadbull lets you turn any Zodiac name in your deck into a search, and Trident lets you turn any name into removal, which was the bread and butter what Yu-Gi-Oh decks need to work. This alone makes Zodiacs very consistent, as no matter what you draw, you'd be able to at least make a play. However, the deck had a secret weapon up its sleeve, Zodiac Ratpier. This was a level 4 Earth Beast Warrior that allowed you to send a Zodiac card from your deck to your graveyard on a normal summon, which combos well with cards like Zodiac Tiger Mortar and Zodiac Combo. But the second effect is what's most important here. All the main deck Zodiac monsters give any Zodiac Xyz they're attached to an effect. Ratpier gives them the effect to detach an Xyz material to summon another Ratpier from your hand or deck. This means that you could make plays such as summon Ratpier, rank up into any Zodiac, then detach to summon another Ratpier from your deck. Then you rank up the original Xyz monster into a Tiger Mortar, use its effect to reattach the original Ratpier from your graveyard to it, and since it's a new monster, the soft once per turn has worn off, and you can use the effect again to summon another Ratpier from deck, allowing you to summon any rank 4 you want. Then you can simply rank up Tiger Mortar into Trident, usually ending on either 2 forms of Disruption, or Disruption plus follow-up off of a single normal summon. A common monster to summon was Daigusto Emerald, which would allow you to attach material to shuffle 3 monsters from your graveyard back into your deck and draw a card, netting you even more card advantage and resetting your Ratpiers for later. And this didn't even need your normal summon, because Zodiac Barrage and MX Saber Invoker could summon Ratpier from your deck. Invoker is a rank 3 that asks for generic materials, so with an engine of 3 Speedroid Terratop, which, if you have no monsters, can special summon itself from your hand for free, and then add a Speedroid monster besides itself from your deck to your hand. You grab Speedroid Takatomborg, which can special summon itself since you have a wind monster on field, and use them to make Invoker, giving you 6 cards between Barrage and Terratop that can allow you to start this full combo without committing your normal summon. But that's not all. Remember, every Zodiac in your deck is essentially any Xyz, including Zodiac Broadbull. So even if you don't open Ratpier or one of your other 6 optimal starters, you can just go grab Ratpier for next turn and then rank up into Trident anyway. This was much earlier in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, so the threat of an OTK was severely lower. On top of that, since your Zodiac lineup is so lean and consistent, the deck could afford to play a lot of non-engine, letting it play a plethora of powerful spell and trap cards to keep them alive for the next turn, even if they were scared of their opponent. Zodiac may not put up the most impressive boards to the modern eye, but it's the most consistent deck in the game and, at the time of release, had the ability to generate so much card advantage each turn that almost nothing could keep up with it. Nearly every deck that we know of that topped an event around this time was on Zodiac. Out of the 19 decks we have lists for in the top 32 of the YCS Paraguay, Zodiac was in 14 of them. Out of the 23 decks we have data for from YCS Atlanta, only 3 of them didn't play Zodiac, and 11 of the 12 decks we know from the top 32 YCS Seattle were also playing Zoo. It was hard to find a top cut that wasn't infested with countless Zodiacs during this year's release, and took heavy action on the ban list to finally stop the deck's reign. And at number 4, we have Pepe, named after the Performapal and Performage archetypes. This deck is remembered for being when Pendulums finally went too far and completely broke the game. The deck had multiple cards that broke the rules of Pendulums. The first was Performapal Monkey Board, a level 6 beast pendulum with a pendulum scale of 1. Its monster effect allows you to discard it from hand and reveal a Performapal or odd-eyes monster in your hand, and reduce the level of all monsters in your hand with that name by 1 for the rest of the turn, which can make them easier to summon. However, the pendulum effect is the main attraction here. Its pen scale becomes 4 if you don't have another Performapal in your other pendulum zone, but that's not really an issue thanks to the next effect. During the main phase of the turn this card is activated, you can add 1 level 4 or lower Performapal monster from your deck to your hand. This could add a ton of cards, but important among them are cards like Performapal Guitar Turtle and Performapal Lizard Draw. These are pendulum monsters with pendulum effects that can draw you a card, a very powerful effect on its own. But they're also search targets for Monkey Board with pen scales of 6. This means that a single Monkey Board can set up scales of 1 and 6 on its own, letting you spam the board with low-level monsters with a pen summon for only 1 card, and even 0 cards if you use Lizard Draw to cycle after you pendulum summon. This was exceedingly rare not only at the time, but even to this day. Pendulum's only real weakness as a mechanic, especially all the way back in Master Rule 3 before they were restricted to summoning pen monsters from the extra deck to link zones, was that it was just very card intensive to actually set up scales, eating 2 entire cards from your hand. Monkey Board basically removed this downside altogether by making setting up your scales card neutral in terms of advantage. Of course, it's not the only absolutely insane pendulum monster in the deck. There was also Performage Plushfire. This level 4 pendulum monster had the effect where, if it was destroyed by battle or card effect, you could special summon another Performage monster from your hand or deck, and this effect was not once per turn. This effect would also trigger if it was destroyed while in your pendulum zone, so you didn't even need to get it to the field proper. So you could do things like scale it and then use a card like Luster Pendulum the Draco Slayer to pop it from your pen scale to add another Plushfire from deck to hand, while also getting a free special summon from the deck. Unfortunately, there's no Performage you could summon from the deck to pop your second Plushfire in your skills, but the deck had tons of ways to go even further for more advantage. Performapal Pendulum Sorcerer on summon lets you target up to 2 of your own cards and destroy them to add the same number of Performapal monsters with different names from your deck to your hand, which can find the previously mentioned Performapal Monkey Board and Guitar Turtle to draw extra cards, while also setting up the pen scales. There was also the infamous Wavering Eyes, a card that somehow did literally everything in this format, and is maybe one of the most singularly powerful cards in any Yu-Gi-Oh format ever during Pepe's Tier 0 reign. This quick play spell destroyed all pendulum scales in play, then applied each effect in sequence based on the number destroyed. Popping 1 lets you deal 500 damage to your opponent. Popping 2 scales lets you add a pendulum monster from your deck to your hand. Popping 3 lets you banish 1 card in the field, and popping 4 scales at once lets you get another copy of Wavering Eyes from your deck to your hand. Using Wavering Eyes to pop your own scales allowed you to trigger your Plushfire while also getting Monkey Board, and as a result, full scales again. But if your opponent was playing Pendulum as well, and they were because this was a Tier 0 format, this not only did all of that, but it also worked as a powerful form of interaction against your opponent's board. The banish effect from Wavering Eyes was essential in this format, as banishing cards in the field was one of the only ways to get removal against pendulum monsters that actually stuck, instead of just putting them back in the extra deck where they could be resummoned. Wavering Eyes was so powerful that Performage Damage Juggler was a constant 3 of in Pepe lists because, in addition to be summonable off of Plushfire, it also had a hand trap effect that could stop your opponent's Wavering Eyes from working because one of its multiple effects did burn you. After doing all of this ridiculous pendulum summoning, the deck would swarm the board with 5 or so level 4 monsters and start stacking them on top of each other to make powerful monsters, like Abyss Dweller, Castel the Skyblaster Musketeer, and Cyber Dragon Infinity by going through some extra hoops. Essentially, this deck consistently ended on an Omni Negate plus another Xyz monster, while also having infinite material do the same thing next turn. And again, this was back before every deck had OTK out of nowhere in every game, and a single Omni Negate was extremely difficult to play through. So having this amount of disruption, plus this much guaranteed follow-up, as well as getting to draw multiple extra cards over the course of the turn, was basically impossible to play against. It of course took massive chunks of top cuts at the biggest tournaments of the year. Of the 13 topping decks we know of from YCS Sydney, only 4 of them weren't on Pepe. Of the 15 lists we have from YCS Atlanta, only 2 weren't a Pepe variant. 8 of the 15 lists we have from YCS Paraguay are Pepe, and 8 of the top 16 slots we have data for YCS Las Vegas, and it was also all but 2 of the 9 topping lists we have from YCS Costa Rica. Pepe was one of the most dominant decks the game had ever seen during its prime, but there are still just a few decks that were even more impressive. And at number 3, we have Snake Eyes. This is a deck centered around a lot of level 1 fire monsters. The deck had a couple of gimmicks. Most of the level 1 monsters, Snake Eyes Ash, Snake Eyes Birch, and Oak, have the effect to send themselves another card on the field to the graveyard to special summon any Snake Eyes from the deck. The other gimmick is most obvious when you look at their boss monster, Snake Eye Flameberg. This guy has a lot of effects, but among them is the effect to target one monster on the field or in the graveyard and put it into its owner's back row as a continuous spell. During your opponent's turn, you can target one spell card in either its back row, that's a monster, and summon it to your field. It also lets you special summon 2 level 1 fire monsters from your graveyard when it's sent from the field or hand to the grave. Other cards like Sinful Spoils of Subversion Snake Eyes allows you to target a monster in the field and push it into the back row as well. A very strong form of removal. Not only did this allow you to get rid of monsters so you could attack directly and don't have to deal with its effect, but it also didn't send it to the graveyard or banishment for any floating effects. And also it wasn't destruction, getting around to multiple forms of insurance. This alone shows why Snake Eyes would be powerful. Its main gimmicks are, similar to Zoodiac's, a way to get any important monster from your deck from any monster you drew, and a powerful form of removal that few other decks get access to. However, the deck also had amazing swarming ability thanks in no small part to Snake Eyes Poplar. This is a level 1 fire that, if it's added to your hand except by drawing it, you can special summon it from your hand. And when this card is summoned, you can add any Snake Eyes spell or trap from your deck to your hand. Finally, it also has an effect where if it's sent from the field to the grave, you can target a fire monster in your graveyard and set it as a continuous spell. This card combined amazingly not only with all of the effects of the other Snake Eye cards, but also with the other generic fire support cards. Snake Eyes Ash added any level 1 fire from your deck to your hand on summon, which would not only add you Poplar, but it also lets you summon it for free. Then you would get a search off of Poplar, which could find a variety of strong cards. But one of the most important for the deck's success is Original Sinful Spoils Snake Eye. This normal spell allows you to send one other face-up card you control to the grave to special summon a level 1 fire monster from your hand or deck. It also has an effect where you can banish it from your grave to put a Snake Eyes or Diabellstar monster from your graveyard on the bottom of your deck and then search a level 1 fire, but not the same turn you use its other effect. It's also a hard once per turn on both effects, as is every effect of Snake Eyes cards, because at this point, Konami finally learned their lesson. Original Sinful Spoils, or OSS for short, was an amazing part of this deck for a lot of reasons. But the most important for now is that it gave the deck's main combo a ton of insurance. After adding OSS with Poplar, you would use it to summon a random Link 1, which at the time was Linkaribo. A Link 1 which could special summon itself from the grave by tributing a level 1 monster, which was occasionally important in specific situations. After linking on Poplar, it would let you reset one of your monsters, which would usually be itself. Then you would use Ash's summon from deck effect to send the Poplar that reset itself to summon Snake Eyes Oak, which had the on summon effect to summon a level 1 fire from your graveyard or banishment. You would get back one of the 2 other Snake Eyes, then use Oak to send your Link 1 and itself to make Flameberg Dragon. Then you'd link off Flameberg and whatever other material you resummon to make an IP Masquerena, which triggers Flameberg to reborn 2 monsters. You use one of the 2 monsters you got back and an IP to make Promethean Princess Bestower of Flames, one of the most insane Link 3s Konami has ever printed. This 2700 attack monster locks you out of summoning non-fire monsters while it's on the field. However, once per turn, it can summon any fire monster from your grave. And if your opponent summons a monster while it's in your graveyard, you can special summon it by destroying 1 fire monster you control and 1 monster your opponent controls. Princess is broken by herself, but Snake Eyes was the best fire deck for a long time. After you make Princess, you use her effect to get Flameberg back and use its effect to reset IP. Then you link off Princess and your last material to make Salamangreat Raging Phoenix. This Link 4 fire monster has multiple effects, but the important one is that if 1 or more fire monsters you control are destroyed while it's in your graveyard, you can target one of those monsters, resummon Phoenix, and then give it the attack of the monster on top of its 2800 attack. Then, during your opponent's turn, you can use Flameberg to resummon your IP from the back row, fully resolving your combo. This board has multiple forms of interaction, all of which are incredibly difficult to deal with. Raging Phoenix is a huge pain that just keeps coming back no matter how many times you destroy it. Promethean Princess is removal that works from the graveyard. IP Masquerena can turn into something like an SP Little Knight or an Appaloosa Bow of the Goddess at quick effect speed to stop whatever you're doing. And Flameberg will float into even more materials if you remove it, and you'll even get to re-trigger the effects of your Snake Eyes on the following turn for even more advantage. So the deck has multiple forms of layered interruption that punish you for trying to stop its plays in just about any way imaginable. And we haven't even covered the entire deck yet. Another thing that made this deck so strong is how many one-card combos it had. If you could resolve Snake Eyes Ash, you would always get to this full end board. Not only did you get 3 Snake Eyes Ash in your deck, you also had 3 Bonfire to add it from your deck to your hand, because all of these level 1 Snake Eyes are Pyro. However, you could also access the combo with OSS, and that card could be set directly from your deck by the effective Diabellstar the Black Witch, which sets any Sinful Spoil cards from deck on summon, and can special summon it itself by sending a card from your hand or field to the graveyard. On top of that, you can also find Diabellstar from your deck with Wanted Seeker of Sinful Spoils, which also had a graveyard effect that lets you draw a card and put back another Sinful Spoil spell or trap. So the deck, without dipping into cards like Small World, had 12 cards that represented full combo on their own, and could even flex as extenders in a pinch. This turbo consistency, along with the fact that you only needed 1 card from your hand for combo, let the deck play a ridiculous amount of non-engine, meaning that the deck had tons of hands where you opened 4 hand traps and 1 card that could snowball into their entire end board if you didn't stop it. This is what makes Snake Eyes one of the most absurd combo decks in the game. It only needs 1 card for full combo. A single hand trap often wasn't enough to stop the deck, as most of its starters were also extenders. And all of this took up a small enough amount of deck space that it was always essentially able to interact with your opponent with hand traps going second. And somehow this isn't even the end of what made the deck broken. Linkuriboh lets you dodge cards like Infinite Impermanence on your Snake Eyes Ash or Poplar by tributing them in response, which led to the card being banned in the coming months. Snake Eyes Oak and Ash worked with any level 1 fires, letting you add cards like Jet Synchron from your deck to access synchro plays for certain hands, as well as letting you use Jet Synchron's recursion ability and then resummon it after it banishes itself. The deck was all over top cuts around this time. It took 20 of the top 32 in YCS Indianapolis, took 18 of the top 32 in YCS Sacramento and at the 2024 European WCQ, 17 of the top 32 in YCS Raleigh, and 40 of the top 16 decks in the 3v3 Las Vegas YCS were Snake Eyes or Fire King Snake Eyes variants, meaning only 8 of the 48 decks that topped the event didn't have a Snake Eyes card in them. It was also similarly dominant in the Team YCS San Jose, where Fire King decks with Snake Eyes and Pure Snake Eyes took 39 spots of the top 16. One thing that makes Snake Eyes surprisingly prolific is that it works as a good engine for other decks, allowing it to see play alongside decks like Fiendsmith, Rescue Ace, and Fire King, which let it slide into almost every big event if it wasn't the star of the show by itself. This deck could do anything, and it had basically no real guardrails outside of every effect in the deck being a hard once per turn. However, this simple difference is what separates Snake Eyes from the number 2 spot on this list, which has no such weakness. And at number 2, we have Spyral. This was a deck based on spy thrillers and had a theme where cards like Super Agent got bonuses if you could properly guess the top card of your opponent's deck. Super Agent being able to special summon itself from hand on a correct guess. It could also target and destroy a spell or trap card your opponent controls on summon, and both of these effects are one of the few hard ones per turns in the deck. To help facilitate this, the deck had cards like Spiral Gear Drone, which lets you look at and rearrange the top 3 cards of your opponent's deck on summon. It also has the effects where it can contribute itself for an attack boost based on how many monsters your opponent has, which was decently useful at times, and you can also banish it another Spiral card from your grave to return a Spiral Super Agent from your graveyard to your hand. None of these effects being once per turns. Drone is a very useful card for the deck to have access to, and luckily you could get it with Spiral Quick Fix. This card lets you add a Spiral Gear card from your deck to your hand on summon, and if you control a Spiral Super Agent, you can discard a card to summon it from your graveyard, but then you banish it when it leaves the field, neither effects being a hard once per turn. There were other good Spiral Gear cards to find off of Quick Fix. Spiral Gear Big Red was an equip spell which could reborn any Spiral monster from grave, though it tragically, or perhaps thankfully, has a hard once per turn. Spyral Gear Last Resort was a monster that lets you target a Spyral monster on your field and equip it from your field or hand to that monster, and it protected it from destruction and targeting while it was equipped. There was also Spyral Gear Utility Wire, which was just a trap card that functioned as removal for your end board. All of this had extra redundancy with Spyral Resort, a field spell that prevented your opponent from targeting your spirals, as well as letting you add a Spyral monster from deck to hand on a soft once per turn. Though it did have a maintenance cost to shuffle a monster back into your deck during the end phase from your graveyard. Resort could also be accessed via the effects of Spyral Master Plan. This level 7 spellcaster had the effects where, on a soft once per turn, it could add a Spyral mission card from deck to hand, and on a hard once per turn, when it was sent to the graveyard from field, you could add a Spyral Resort from hand to deck, and also a Spyral monster besides itself. The Spyral missions you could search included Spyral Mission Assault, which you could banish from your grave to special summon a Spyral from hand, and Spyral Mission Rescue, which you could banish from grave to special a Spyral monster from the grave. They have other effects, but those don't really matter. And also, yes, they aren't once per turns. You also had a few extra cards like Spyral Tough that, if you guessed the top card of your opponent's deck correctly, could target and pop one card your opponent controls, and the deck's resident boss monster, Spyral Sleeper. This is a level 8 fiend with 2800 attack, which can't be normal summon or set, but can be special summoned from hand by banishing 3 Spyral cards from your graveyard, and can't be special summoned in other ways. As a quick effect, you can target one Spyral monster you control and 2 other cards your opponent controls and destroy them. And if it's destroyed by battle or a card effect, it blows up your entire board and lets you special summon a super agent from your deck. This initial wave of Spyral cards was fine. It was a competent deck, but it couldn't quite get started fast enough to compete when it was first released. A big part of this was that Spyral Master Plan was a bit difficult to get out, requiring 2 tributes and not having an inherent special summon condition. While you could Big Red her out, that required more setup and used your 1 archetype Easy Reborn for the turn. That really stinks because Master Plan not only lets you go +3 if you summoned it and sent it to the graveyard in 1 turn, it also gave you a ton of consistency by letting you get access to Resort easily. So what happens when you get rid of this tiny little restriction on the deck? Enter Spyral Double Helix, the single card that broke this deck for multiple formats. This is a Link 2 monster that requires 2 Spyral monsters. Its name is Spyral Super Agent while on the field, and if you could guess the type of your opponent's top card, you could take a Spyral card from your deck and either add it to your hand or special summon to a zone this card points to, though it may as well have just said special summon Master Plan from deck. This card is a hard once per turn, but that's a small consolation at this point. The deck's main game plan was usually to get a drone out to check the top cards of your opponent's deck, then link monsters off for Double Helix. Then you'd grab Master Plan and use it to add Rescue. Then link her off and trigger Master Plan's second effect. Then, depending on what you had, you would usually find either more copies of Quick Fix or something else that you could summon for free. You would then use the effect of Quick Fix in your graveyard, which most combo lines to Double Helix allowed you to get out beforehand, to discard more Quick Fixes from hand and get a ton of Spyral Gear cards from deck and get Spyral Mission Rescue into the grave. You would then overlink all of your Quick Fixes so they didn't get banished, and then you could use the Rescue you dumped to get back Master Plan. Search another Rescue, link off Master Plan, and then Xyz for another link, and then do this all over again until you've run through all 3 copies of Rescue. At this point, you'll have enough link materials to make basically anything you want, or at the very least, be able to summon Sleeper and equip it with Last Resort that you searched over the course of your turn. The core loop of Master Plan for Rescue, Quick Fix from Grave discard Rescue, Rescue back Master Plan, add another Rescue, generated so many resources that this deck could put up some of the most egregious boards the game has ever seen, at least at this point in history. This deck feels like the point where Konami decided to never print a soft once per turn on an effect that lets you go +1 literally ever again, because 1 card let this deck go from a non-issue to one of the most broken things ever. While it didn't put up infinite negate boards that you'd see in YouTube videos on Master Duel nowadays, the amount of advantage this deck generated back in the day was more than enough for Spyral to essentially clear the entire field. This deck was so good that even after Resort, Quick Fix, and Drone were limited to 1, the deck made a resurgence in 2020 thanks to Magician Souls, and Konami had to finally pull the trigger and just ban Master Plan to stop the deck from looping Rescue for infinite value. At this point in our year 2025, Master Plan might be able to come off the ban list, seeing as it's unbanned at Master Duel and not really causing any problems. As for results, Spyral was 10 of the 15 lists we know of for the top cut of YCS Melbourne, 12 of the top 16 at ARGCS Richmond, and 11 of top 16 at ARGCS Orlando. It was also the most represented deck in YCS Paraguay and Dallas, but almost all of the top 32 of those events are unknown lists. This is another deck where data on tournaments around this time has surprising amount of holes, but most events at this time are filled with Spyral from top to bottom. There is a discussion to be had about if this or Snake Eyes should be higher on this list. Snake Eyes is, in terms of time frame and tournament results, the most dominant deck we've seen in the last decade. But that's mostly just because Konami refused to hit the deck in a meaningful way. While they should have banned Master Plan immediately, at least they limited Quick Fix Drone and Resort, and it actually hurt Spyral a bit. And in the case of Snake Eyes, instead of just banning OSS like they eventually had to, Konami spent months trying to convince everyone they cared about the metagame by limiting one of the Snake Eyes' 12 card starters in succession. Usually, whichever one had been out the longest after they printed the next one card starter for the deck. Snake Eyes wasn't that dominant because it was that problematic, but because Konami just didn't want to take meaningful action against the deck. Spyral was, at its time, more broken from a card design standpoint than Snake Eyes were. Still, there's one deck that's even more overpowered when compared to these two titans of Tier 0 formats. And we all know what the number one spot is. Everyone give a round of applause or jeers for Ishizu Tearlament, the most broken Tier 0 deck ever released. This is a deck of very depressed mermaid ladies who fuse into bigger, sadder mermaids from the graveyard. The small tier names, Tearlament, Havness, Meryl, and Shiren, had a shared effect where, when they're sent to the graveyard by a card effect, you can fusion summon a monster by putting materials from your hand, field, or graveyard on the bottom of your deck, including themselves. Most of the effects on these cards are hard once per turns for the record. They also each had their own effects. Merly milling you for 3 on summon, Shiren letting you special it from hand by pitching a card from your hand to the grave, then milling 3, and Havness having the ability where if your opponent activates a monster effect while it's in your hand, you can special summon it and then mill 3. You also had Tearlament's Rhino Heart, a level 4 that when summoned sends a Tearlament monster from your hand or deck to the grave. Also, if it's sent to the grave, you can special summon it, but then you have to send a Tearlament card from your hand to the graveyard afterwards, and it gets banished when it leaves the field. As for fusion monsters, you had a lot of options. Tearlament's Kid Kolos only asked for a Tearlament and an Aqua monster. When it was special summoned, you could either add a Tearlament card from your deck to your hand, or send it to the graveyard. You could also target a monster you control and a Tearlament monster in your hand or grave, and send a monster on field to the graveyard to then special summon that targeted monster. And finally, when it's sent to the graveyard by a card effect, you mill 5 cards. Tearlament's Rukolos requires Kid Kolos and a Tearlament monster's material and has a ton of powerful effects. Its effects are that your other Aqua monsters can't be destroyed by battle. When your opponent activates a card effect that would special summon a monster, you can send a Tearlament monster from your hand or field to the grave to negate that card's activation and destroy it. And if this fusion summoned card is sent to the graveyard by a card effect, you can special summon it again. So the first time it's sent to the grave after being fusion summoned, it comes back. There's also Tearlament's Kaleido Heart, which needs a Rhino Heart and 2 Aqua monsters. It can't be used as a fusion material. And when special summoned, or when an Aqua monster is sent to the grave by a card effect while it's on the field, you can shuffle any one of your opponent's cards into the deck. If this card is sent to the graveyard by a card effect, you can special summon it and then send a Tearlament's card from your deck to the graveyard. On top of these powerful boss monsters, the deck also had Primeval Planet Pillarino, a field spell that adds any Tearlament monster from deck to hand on activation, and whenever a Tearlament you control or in your grave is shuffled back into the deck or extra deck, you can target a card in the field and destroy it, giving the deck even more removal and consistency. You also had powerful back row cards like Tearlament Crime and Tearlament Zodiac, which not only had strong interactive effects, but also had effects to plus when they were sent to the graveyard by a card effect, including milling. Basically, it was a powerful fusion deck that worked by milling, rather than having to actually draw its card like most plebeian archetypes. This was already enough to make Tearlaments one of the 2 best decks in Power of the Elements, going neck and neck with sprites and slowly pulling ahead as the format was explored. The deck had a bit of a reputation for playing on both players' turns, thanks to Havness's hand trap effect that could mill immediately, letting you fusion summon right away, or get extra cards with lucky mills. And after they got 1 turn to set up, they had so many floating effects that they could fuse a couple of times on your opponent's turn in most games. All of this changed with the release of Magnificent Mavens, which gave it the Ishizu cards. Yugioh, Keldo, Mudora, and Kelbek were all designed to work with Exchange of the Spirit in their own little anime archetype. But everyone immediately figured out this was terrible, and they could just play them in good decks instead. Kelbek and Yugioh had the effects that, when they're sent to the graveyard from hand or deck, both players mill 5 cards. Mudora and Keldo had the effects that, if they were on the field or grave, you could banish them to target 3 cards in either graveyard and shuffle them into the deck as a quick effect. These cards worked wonderfully in Tearlaments, giving you way more materials when they were milled for fusion summons, as well as powerful forms of graveyard interaction that you didn't even have to draw. Remember that the Tier Shell, before the release of the Ishizu cards, was already proving itself to be the deck to beat in the format thanks to being able to put up so many forms of disruption without eating into many resources. These cards supercharged the deck. It made it so if you happened to mill one of the Ishizu millers and you weren't playing to yourself or didn't have a dimension shifter that you could activate, the game was often just kind of over. The deck's reputation for comboing on your opponent's turn harder than on your own got way worse at this time, as a single Havness had an extremely high chance of milling important targets with all of the Tearlaments and Ishizu cards in the deck, to the point where this was less as something that happened every once in a while, and more of just a core facet of how the deck played. The deck started putting up big results quickly. They got 26 of the top 32 spots at YCS Pasadena, 18 of the top 32 at NA Remote Duel YCS, 18 of top 32 at YCS Costa Rica, 17 of top 43 at YCS Dortmund, and 19 of top 32 at YCS Sydney. The thing about Tearlaments is that it plays on such a different axis than most other Yu-Gi-Oh decks. It doesn't really care as much about things like card advantage as much as it does on how many things it can mill over the course of the game to start its plays, which makes beating it with anything besides an Abyss Dweller pretty much impossible. Its first turn board was immediately threatening. It got almost infinite value over the course of the game, and it was more than capable of stopping your plays with its spot removal and the Ishizu Shufflers. The deck was so good that even after its best card, Kit Kalos, was banned, the deck could afford to play garbage like King of the Swamp to make a Root Kalos anyway and still be tier 0. In Tearlament's land, card advantage is a myth and it can't hurt you. As for performance, Tearlaments is in a bit of a strange spot. While it did have great showings at events like YCS Sydney, YCS Pasadena, and YCS Dortmund, there were comparatively less events right at the start of this format, as things were still picking up after the lockdowns. Despite the slowness of tournaments around this time, Tearlaments still picked up a similar number of results to the other tier 0 decks in this video, which really shows how powerful the deck was. The reason Tearlaments takes the top spot on this list is that, despite the fact that we've gone through some pretty intensive power creep over the past couple of years since the deck first came out and was banned, this deck would not only be the best deck in the game if it came back unhit today, it would be another tier 0 format. In fact, whenever people play no ban list tournaments, it's always Tearlaments that just sweeps the events. It's currently the best deck of all time, and still better than the other tier 0 decks that came out after it.